The night was quiet in the desert town, the kind of silence that wrapped around you like a blanket, until the bar door slammed open. Inside Rusty Jack's, old Earl Thompson, 84 years old, a veteran with decades of service etched into his weathered face, sipped his black coffee in peace. He wasn't looking for trouble. But trouble had just walked in. A hulking biker swaggered through the doorway, leather vest creaking, tattoos crawling down his arms, sunglasses gleaming under the dim lights. He spotted Earl at the counter, smirked, and stomped forward. Bars. No place for fossils, the biker sneered, slamming his hand down on the counter. Earl didn't move, didn't flinch, just looked up with eyes that had seen jungles, deserts, and battlefields. The biker shoved him, hard. The coffee spilled, the cane clattered to the floor. Gasps rippled through the room, but Earl only steadied, himself quiet as stone. No anger, no fear, just calm. Outside, a young man slipped into the night, phone pressed to his ear, a number Earl had given him years ago, a number never meant to be dialed unless the world itself was tilting. 30. Minutes later, glasses rattled on shelves as a thunderous roar shook the ground. The neon sign flickered. Dust blasted across the lot. Every head turned toward the sky. And there it was, a Black Hawk helicopter descending, rotors ripping the night apart. And in that moment, the entire town learned. You don't shove a man like Earl Thompson without consequences. The sun dipped low behind the horizon, spilling the last of its amber light over a cracked two-lane highway that stretched through a sleepy desert town. The roadside bar known as Rusty Jack's stood like an old sentinel, its neon sign buzzing faintly in the dusk. A few motorcycles leaned against the side of the building, chrome glinting in the fading glow. Inside, the atmosphere was warm and familiar. The dull clink of glasses, the faint strum of a jukebox playing an old country tune, and the low murmur of small-town regulars. At the far end of the bar sat Earl Thompson, an 84-year-old veteran of 3 wars. His shoulders were still broad, but his back slightly hunched with the weight of years. Deep creases lined his sun-worn face, and silver hair peeked out from under a plain dark cap. He wore a plaid shirt tucked into faded khakis, a denim jacket, draped over the back of his stool, and a cane resting against the counter. Earl wasn't drinking whiskey like the rest of the patrons. He had a coffee, black and strong. The barmaid, Sandra, always brewed a fresh pot when she saw him limp through the door. To everyone here, Earl was more than just an old man. He was a story, the kind of story people told their kids about sacrifice, loyalty, and service. He didn't boast about it, never asked for discounts, never wore medals to remind people who he was. But the town knew. The calm hum of conversation shattered when the front door slammed open, rattling the hinges. A blast of night air rushed in along with the heavy stomp of boots. A man in his 30s swaggered inside, leather vest, arms, inked with tattoos, beard down to his chest, and aviator sunglasses that looked ridiculous under dim bar lighting. This was Duke, leader of a small biker crew that often prowled nearby highways. He thrived on intimidation. Most nights he got what he wanted: free drinks, respect he hadn't earned, and silence from anyone who dared cross him. His gang trailed in behind him, laughing too loud, tossing pool balls around like toys, their leather jackets creaking as they claimed space. Duke scanned the room, looking for an easy target. His eyes settled on Earl, who hadn't even turned. From his coffee, "Hey, old-timer," Duke called out, voice dripping with mockery. "Bars for real men, not for fossils. Why don't you go home and knit a sweater?" The room went still. A few locals exchanged uneasy glances. Earl slowly turned his head, eyes calm but steady. "Just here for my coffee," he said softly. That should have been the end of it, but bullies don't back down when met with dignity. Duke strutted forward, slamming his palm on the bar next to Earl's mug. The veteran didn't flinch. "You deaf, Gramps. I said this ain't your place." Sandra tried to intervene. "Duke, leave him be. He's not bothering anyone." But Duke sneered and shoved Earl hard on the shoulder. The old man rocked back, his cane toppling to the floor, his coffee spilling across the counter. A collective Gasp ran through the bar. Earl steadied himself with both hands on the counter, jaw tightening. His body was aged, but his eyes, those sharp steel blue eyes, burned with the fire of someone who'd stared down danger long before Duke was even born. "Big man," Earl said evenly, "pushing someone 4 times your age." The bar fell silent. You could hear the jukebox needle scratch as the song ended. Duke smirked, expecting Earl to cower. Instead, Earl bent down, retrieved his cane, and sat upright again without another word. Something in his calm unnerved the biker, but Duke covered it with a laugh, turning to the room. "See that? Old dog can't even bark. Pathetic." His crew roared with laughter, but a few locals shifted uncomfortably. They knew they had just witnessed a line being crossed. While Duke puffed himself up, a young man named Kyle, sitting near the door, slipped outside with his phone. Kyle was a mechanic in town, one of the few people Earl had mentored when he was a restless teenager. Earl had taught him how to change oil, how to hold himself with dignity, how to keep calm under pressure. Tonight, watching that biker shove Earl had lit something inside him. Kyle dialed a number he rarely used, a number Earl had once given him in confidence. "Only call if there's real trouble," Earl had said. The line clicked. A voice answered, calm and clipped. "Black Hawk Unit, Special Liaison. Who's speaking?" Kyle swallowed. "My name's Kyle Mason. Earl Thompson told me to use this number if things ever got bad. Something just happened. He was shoved, threatened. By bikers. It's escalating." There was silence, then the voice replied firmly. "Understood. Stay put. 30 minutes. The line went dead. Kyle stared at the phone. He didn't know what he'd just set in motion. Inside, the tension grew thicker. Duke ordered rounds of beer, on the house, daring anyone to refuse. No one moved. Sandra looked to Earl, but he just gave her a small shake of his head, telling her not to risk it. The minutes dragged on. Earl sat quietly, eyes forward, posture straight, as if waiting for something unseen. Duke grew restless, annoyed that his shove hadn't rattled the old man. He paced, throwing darts wildly, bumping into patrons. His crew barked like hyenas at every crude joke he made, but Earl wasn't watching them anymore. His ears picked up something faint through the thick bar walls, a low, rhythmic thump in the distance. At first, no one noticed. Then a glass on the bar began to tremble. A ceiling lamp swung lightly. Outside, dust swirled along the lot. The faint thump grew louder, steady, mechanical, a sound Earl knew better than anyone. Helicopter rotors. Patrons rushed to the windows. A dark silhouette appeared against the night sky, descending fast. Searchlights swept the ground. The building rattled as wind and dirt blasted across the parking lot. Duke and his crew stumbled outside, shielding their faces against the roar. "What the hell is that?" Duke shouted, his bravado cracking. The Black Hawk helicopter landed in a storm of dust and debris, its massive blades slicing the air with thunderous force. The side doors of the Black Hawk slid open, and out stepped 6 men in dark tactical uniforms. They moved with precision, each step measured, each movement synchronized. Their leader, a tall figure with a trimmed beard, carried no visible weapon but radiated command. He walked straight toward Earl, who had risen slowly to his feet, cane in hand. The leader stopped, snapped a salute sharp as lightning, and said, loudly enough for all to hear, "Colonel Thompson, sir. Black Hawk Unit reporting." Gasps filled the air. Duke froze, sunglasses slipping from his nose. Earl nodded once, returning the salute with steady dignity. "Good to see you, boys," he said, voice gravelly but strong. The unit formed a protective semicircle around Earl, their presence undeniable. The leader turned to Duke, whose earlier arrogance had drained away, replaced by pale shock. "This man," the leader said firmly, pointing to Earl, "is a decorated veteran who served his country longer than you've been alive. You will show respect." Duke opened his mouth, but no words came. His crew shifted uncomfortably behind him. The locals, emboldened now, stepped closer to the windows and doors, some muttering approval. Earl raised a hand. "That's enough. No need to frighten them. Lessons already taught." For the first time, Duke looked small. He shuffled forward, head down. I didn't know," he stammered. "Didn't know who you were." Earl tapped his cane against the ground. You don't need to know who a man is to treat him with respect. Age, status, medals, none of that should matter. What matters is decency. Duke swallowed hard, then muttered, I'm sorry. The silence that followed wasn't awkward. It was heavy with meaning. Everyone in that bar would remember this night for the rest of their lives. The Black Hawk leader nodded to Earl. Sir, we'll be nearby if ever you need us again. Earl gave him a faint smile. I appreciate that. But tonight I think the lesson's been delivered. The soldiers filed back into the helicopter. The engines roared once more, blades slicing the night sky. Dust lifted and swirled as the massive machine rose into the darkness, disappearing beyond the horizon. When the air cleared, Earl sat back down at the bar, lifting his fresh cup of coffee Sandra had set quietly before him. He took a sip, unbothered, as if nothing extraordinary had happened. The patrons cheered softly, raising their glasses. Duke and his crew slipped away into the night, their swagger gone. Kyle came back inside, eyes wide with awe. Earl, who are you really? The old man smiled faintly, eyes twinkling. Just someone who served, that's all. And with that, Earl went back to his coffee. Outside, the desert wind carried the fading echo of rotors, leaving behind only silence and a story that would be told in this town for generations. Word spread like wildfire by morning. Everyone in the small desert town had heard about what happened outside Rusty Jack's. Farmers at the feed store whispered about the helicopter that shook their barns. Mechanics swore the dust storm cracked their shop windows. Kids replayed the sight of soldiers saluting an old man like it was a movie scene. Some people asked how Earl had that kind of connection. Others shrugged and said, Earl's been through things we'll never know. Best not to pry. But curiosity had taken root. Duke didn't return to Rusty Jack's for days. He and his crew were seen riding out of town before sunrise, their engines quieter than usual. In a world where intimidation was their currency, being humbled by an old veteran, in front of everyone, had stripped Duke of his edge. He sat alone at a diner 30 miles away, replaying the shove in his mind. He hadn't just disrespected an old man, he had exposed his own weakness, the need to assert power where it wasn't earned. For the first time, shame gnawed at him. Kyle couldn't let it go. He visited Earl the next afternoon, finding him on the porch of a modest house at the edge of town. Earl was whittling a piece of wood, the desert wind tugging at his jacket. Earl, Kyle began cautiously. Those men, that helicopter. What was that? Earl glanced up, eyes narrowing slightly, then returned to his carving. Old friendships, old debts, Kyle pressed. You were more than just a soldier, weren't you? Earl didn't answer directly. He just handed Kyle the half-finished carving, a small hawk, wings outstretched, and said, Some stories aren't meant for campfires, they're meant to be carried quietly. Back at Rusty Jack's, Sandra replayed the night in her mind. She had seen Earl come in almost every evening for years, quiet and steady. She had served him countless coffees, joked with him, asked about his garden. But she had never once seen him stand taller than when the unit saluted him. She told herself she would never underestimate quiet strength again. People carried worlds inside them, scars, victories, losses, and most never revealed them. Earl had reminded her of that truth in the most unforgettable way. On the fifth night, Duke returned, alone this time. His bike rolled up slow, headlights cutting across the dirt lot. Patrons stiffened, unsure if trouble was brewing again. But when Duke entered, he didn't swagger. His sunglasses were gone, his vest zipped tight, his head bowed slightly. He walked straight to Earl, who sat at his usual spot with his coffee. Silence filled the bar. I came to say thank you, Duke said quietly. You taught me something I should have learned long ago. Earl studied him for a long moment. Then he simply nodded. That was enough. Late that night, the thrum of rotors echoed faintly again. The town looked skyward, searching. A Black Hawk passed overhead, this time without landing, its silhouette cut across the moon before vanishing into the distance. It was a reminder. Earl wasn't just an old man in khakis with a cane. He was part of something larger, something that still moved like unseen currents beneath ordinary life. Sleep didn't come easy for Earl. He sat awake in his chair, the television, flickering softly, mind wandering back decades. He remembered jungles, deserts, frozen mountains. He remembered faces of men he'd led, some who came home, some who didn't. The Black Hawk unit wasn't just comrades. They were the last link to those years. They had promised each other long ago, if one called, the others would come. No matter the time, no matter the place. That promise had brought them here. That promise still lived. Kyle started spending more time with Earl after that night. They worked on small projects together, fixing fences, tuning engines, tending to Earl's garden. Earl never lectured, never boasted. Instead, he taught through small lessons. When you build something, son, Earl said while tightening a bolt, make sure it lasts. Not just in metal or wood, but in how you carry yourself. That's what holds up when storms come. Kyle nodded, knowing these weren't just words about tools. The bar itself changed after that night. People spoke with more patience. Patrons tipped Sandra better. Strangers were greeted with nods instead of suspicion. The memory of the helicopter landing outside Rusty Jack's had become a story of respect, one that reshaped how people treated each other. Even Duke's crew, when they drifted back weeks later, carried themselves differently. They weren't saints, but they no longer mocked or shoved. They sat quietly, drank their beers, and nodded at Earl when they left. On his 85th birthday, Earl returned to the bar, cane tapping softly on the floor. Sandra brought him a slice of pie on the house. Kyle sat beside him, smiling, like family. The jukebox played an old song from Earl's youth, one he hadn't heard in years. For a moment, his eyes glistened. Not from sadness, but from the quiet recognition that his story had come full circle. He wasn't a man chasing glory. He wasn't a man demanding honor. He was simply a man who had lived, served, and endured, and who had reminded an entire town that respect is not earned through fear, but through dignity. Outside, the desert wind howled softly, carrying away the last traces of dust from that unforgettable night when a Black Hawk had landed outside the bar. The morning after his birthday, Earl walked slowly through town, cane tapping on the cracked sidewalk. People waved from porches, tipping hats, and raising coffee mugs in his direction. Kids on bikes slowed down, whispering, "That's him, the one the helicopter came for." Earl smiled faintly. He wasn't used to being a symbol. He was just Earl, a man who liked his coffee black and his evenings quiet. Yet now, everywhere he went, eyes followed with newfound respect. Sheriff Daniel stopped by Earl's porch later that week. He leaned against his cruiser, hat tucked under one arm. "Earl," he said, "you know folks are still buzzing about that night. I've had reporters call, asking if it's true." Earl didn't flinch. "And what did you tell them?" "That? You're just an old man who wants to be left alone." Earl chuckled softly. "Good answer." The sheriff tipped his hat, knowing Earl's past was deeper than paperwork could explain. Some things weren't meant for headlines. Far from town, Duke rode alone across the desert highway. He couldn't shake Earl's words. Respect wasn't about knowing someone's rank or medals, it was about decency. Duke had spent his life puffing himself up, hiding fear with noise. Now, for the first time, he wanted something different. He pulled over at a roadside diner, sat down with his coffee, and began scribbling notes on a napkin. Plans. Maybe it was time to build something better, a bike repair shop, a new start. Earl's lesson had planted a seed. One night at Rusty Jack's, the jukebox played an old military ballad by chance. Earl froze, fork halfway to his mouth. Memories surged, of comrades singing that very tune on a transport plane decades ago, voices blending in tired harmony. Sandra noticed the change in his expression. "You okay, Earl?" she asked gently. He nodded slowly. "Just ghosts passing through. Friendly ones." The song ended, but the air in the bar remained heavy, as if those voices lingered still. Kyle found himself restless. Earl's presence had awakened something in him, a hunger for purpose. One evening, he blurted it out while they sat fixing an old lawnmower. I want to serve, Earl. Not the same way you did, maybe, but I want to stand for something bigger than myself. Earl studied him. Service takes many forms, son. Army, firehouse, community, even just being the man others can lean on. Don't chase medals, chase meaning. Kyle absorbed those words like scripture. One afternoon, Sandra stopped by Earl's house with a casserole. On his table lay an old photo, faded, edges curling. It showed a younger Earl with his unit, uniforms dusty, arms slung around each other. In the corner, the emblem of a hawk was stitched on their sleeves. Sandra picked it up gently. They're the ones, aren't they? The men who came for you. Earl smiled wistfully. Some of them. Others. They didn't make it back. But they're all with me still. Word spread further than the town. Veterans from neighboring counties began showing up at Rusty Jack's, drawn by the story. Some wore caps, some wore jackets with patches, some carried canes like Earl. They came not for spectacle, but for kinship. Soon, Thursday nights became unofficial veteran nights. The bar filled with old stories, laughter, tears, and the quiet understanding that only those who'd served could share. Earl, though humble, had become their anchor. One clear night, the Black Hawk returned, this time without drama. It landed, softly in the empty lot, rotors kicking up gentle swirls of dust. Earl walked out slowly, cane in hand, as the crew disembarked. They didn't come for battle. They came for dinner. Sandra cooked, Kyle served, and the bar filled with laughter as old comrades reminisced. For once, the machine of war carried only the warmth of reunion. Weeks later, Duke returned again, but this time, not as the man who shoved an old veteran. He parked a rusty pickup across the lot, its bed loaded with tools. A small wooden sign leaned against the bumper. Duke's Repair, opening soon. He stepped inside Rusty Jack's, nervous but determined. Earl, he said, voice steady. I'm trying to build something honest. Thought you ought to know. Earl gave him a rare smile. Good. Build it strong. Months passed. The dust storm of that night faded into memory, but the story never did. Children asked their parents to retell it at bedtime. Strangers came through town asking, is this where the Black Hawk landed? And Earl? He kept his routine. Coffee at the bar, tending to his garden, helping Kyle with small projects. Life went on quietly just as he liked it, but everyone who lived through it carried the same unshakable truth. One night, when arrogance tried to trample dignity, respect descended from the skies in roaring blades, and an old veteran reminded them all what true strength looks like.